Hello and welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm going to be doing my first pick top lane tier list for patch 14.13. So if you enjoy the content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. I'm going to lay out a criteria to begin with, so there isn't as much confusion around the placement of some of these champions. This is primarily going to be targeted towards the average player base, so it can be utilized by the most amount of people. I don't really want to skew this for like pro play and elite matchups, as the dynamic tends to change. It tends to be a bit more skill based, and I more want to focus on the general kind of idea of what functions well as a first pick top laner and what has many weaknesses, maybe because it's directly used as a counter option or other reasons which can be specified as I cover the champions. So to begin with, S tier champions are strong, which can be like blinded and have very limited counter picks. Maybe you can ban them out, or maybe you can have a like solid response in rune or itemization choices. A tier champions have a couple more, but they tend to be either unpopular or niche. You can kind of get away with some of the options here. B tier, similar, but has a larger amount of options. Maybe some of these matchups are harder to play, but don't inherently completely remove the champion and can have some level of nicheness to them. C tier champions have answers and will begin to be quite disadvantageous in these situations. And then D tier, these are the champions which will primarily be used as counter pick options. You'll rarely see these champions get blinded, as they tend to have a lot of answers. Maybe it's because they're just primarily used against one class. For example, Jax is a good one here. He's primarily used as an anti-auto attacker, good against range, but tends to be not as optimal against a lot of the other options, as his kit tends to be tailored towards his E, which is where a lot of his strength lies. So let's begin the tier list. To begin with, Garen is going to be within the A tier. Garen is in a pretty good spot at the moment. He can opt into sustain through the likes of D shield. His passive sustain also gives him a lot of options in being able to kind of sit back, let the wave come into him, kind of mitigate a lot of harass. W also provides a nice shield, some damage mitigation there. He has good matchups which he can all in on. His primary weakness tends to just be range. If someone could shove him off the wave early on until his passive really stacks up into the mid game, it can be quite hard to pilot those matchups. I'd recommend banning the likes of Camille or Kale. Kale tends to be a bit more low elo skew. Camille tends to be a pretty good answer higher up. You can play the matchup, but against good Camilles, they will really, really punish you whenever you try to step up to the wave. Garen within the A tier. Darius is going to be in the C tier. Darius isn't in the greatest spot at the moment. He has been stronger in the past. Ghost obviously got nerfed, combined with some of the matchups being quite bad for him at the moment. He's obviously very weak to kite and range. The likes of Vayne and Yorick work quite nicely into him. I'd recommend Darius as primary an answer to some of the other bruiser matchups, or just primarily tank matchups where you can comfortably stack up your passive, you can get good sieges going. Darius is going to be in the C tier. Set is actually going to be my first S tier option at the moment, so Set is in a really good spot. You have lots of options on this champion. Once again, you can opt into things like D shield and second wind. It's pretty standard options. Once again, his passive also provides him a decent amount of sustain and healing. Absorb life can even be taken into matchups where you're not really going to have kill threat. You can kind of drop the triumph in that space. Overall, he's still weak to range. Like a lot of the high popularity juggernauts will struggle into range. That is where a lot of the problems of the class lie. But once you have Stridebreaker online, you're no longer as punished in that matchup, and you can oftentimes catch them, and then it can flip, and you can quite easily snowball. Obviously, you can have bad games where you fall behind early, but if you're able to consistently create advantages, the champion's really strong in its current state, a great first pick option. Not too many hard counters. I'd recommend banning Volibear. Seems to be the best option into Set at the moment. You can quite comfortably trade into him, sustain through him, and oftentimes if you're Set, I'd recommend running Ignite so you can punish him if he tries to go for an all-in and try and utilize the W as much as you can. Moving on, we have Aatrox. Aatrox is going to be within my B tier. He has some relatively hard matchups. He tends to be pretty weak to range and high mobility, where they can dash through his Qs, avoid them quite easily. Range obviously can punish him from a distance, making it hard to land his W and his Qs. Singed and Vayne tend to punish him quite a bit, but Aurelia obviously is another one. There are quite a few things which he can be punished by. He's generalistically good into tank matchups where you can make use of your sustain. Now that they've pushed Aatrox back to being more of a fighter champion rather than like this Profane Hydra Assassin, which is something you can opt into some of those range matchups where you play more for your one shot, as you're not able to maintain a combat pattern against them, and you're mainly just playing on your burst. But he's a solid B tier option here. Mordekaiser is going to be my A tier. So Mordekaiser obviously can be answered by the likes of a good Fiora, but generalistically, Mordekaiser doesn't have a huge amount of answers outside of that. He tends to be pretty weak to range and stall, but then some of those are harder to execute. Some of those tend to be a bit more niche. Vayne tends to fit pretty well against Mordekaiser. That is definitely a matchup you will struggle in. I'd recommend banning it. Of course, if you're not as punished by that matchup, maybe you can like play around it with like D-Shield or Second Wind. Maybe you're running like Absorb Life, stuff like that, which can kind of mitigate some of her harass. Then the likes of Fiora are always a solid ban. Mordekaiser sits at like a low A tier, high B tier spot. Moving on, we have Nasus. Nasus is also going to be my A tier. Ever since they buffed Nasus, he's definitely been able to opt into different playstyles. Obviously, the E spam on the wave can really help against ranged matchups. It actually creates, it actually really removes a lot of his weaker matchups, where oftentimes he can be weak to harass early on into the game. But if you're dropping EOs on the wave, you can play like into the Rumble matchup and kind of get away with it, stuff like that. Obviously, he does tend to be pretty weak to stall and all in, where the champions can kind of like get a large chunk of his health bar out before he's really able to press R and then retaliate with Q combat patterns. Darius, Garen, stuff like that can be quite punishing to play against. I'd recommend banning Garen. That does tend to be one of his harder matchups. Garen Q can obviously break Wither, which can be quite punishing, and yeah, he's a solid A tier option, but different playstyles can definitely help in this space. Moving on with Volibear. So Volibear is going to be within my B tier. He is in a pretty decent spot at the moment. Obviously, he has the Roa Flicker Blades build being played pretty standard on him at the moment. He tends to be pretty weak to range and kite. Oftentimes, you want to kind of alternate between Q and W max into range matchups. Q max can be quite nice if it allows you to engage onto the target. W tends to be pretty standard. That is what you really do want against a lot of the fighter champions, but Q is always an option here. On top of this, Vayne, Jax tend to be pretty good bans. Jax obviously mitigates a lot of his auto attack based abilities for Q, the W, and then can punish him when he's trying to stack up to his passive. That can be a pretty good ban, but other than that, Vayne, once again, tends to be a pretty good answer to Volibear and some of the other juggernauts here. Moving on with Jax. Jax is actually going to be my D tier. There are lots of neutralizers to Jax. Like Jax can struggle into like tank. Well, there's not so much struggle into tanks. It's more they'll go even, and then the tank can have a lot of value later on into the game. Or in certain cases, he will just lose to fighters. Some of the fighters can just overwhelm him. Maybe they're not as countered by his E. Lots of Jax's matchups are very much determined by his E value. If he can have a lot of value with that spell, he can definitely really dominate the matchup and feel really punishing to play against. But if the matchup doesn't, then yeah, he will struggle. There are loads of solid answers to Jax. I'd recommend Alawi. If you are playing Jax, obviously, ban Alawi. That matchup tends to be one of your worst. She can really punish you with her E and then play off your E range. And yeah, that tends to be one of the weaker ones. Her R all-in really counters your ability to all-in. Jack's going to be within my D tier. Malphite, obviously well known for being pretty counterable. He's very much answered by Silas. That is the primary one. You have to ban Silas for the most part. If you ever plan on first picking Malphite, I wouldn't recommend it though. You want to pick this champion as an answer to AD team comps. Same little as a lot of the D tier goes. Jax, obviously, good into range, good into AA. Malphite, good into AD. Obviously, you are going to be punished by the likes of Silas, by some of the tankier matchups. Sion, Ornn come to mind as being pretty bad matchups for him. But yeah, tank AP, I'd recommend avoiding it for the most part. He is going to be within the D tier. Moving on, we have Teemo. So Teemo is going to be within my B tier. He is weak to primarily AP-based champions, which aren't as reliant on their auto attacks. Obviously, Teemo Q tends to counter a lot of the auto attack based matchups within the top lane. He tends to be pretty weak to tanks. Yorick and Sion are pretty good matchups. Obviously, Yorick can be quite punishing to play against. If Yorick lands an E or gets a W on you, then you can oftentimes just be one shot in that matchup. The blind doesn't really have as much value as it doesn't. You can't blind for the the little gremlins, the Mistwalkers. Obviously, you can blind Yorick, which can mitigate his ability to land a Q on you, but he can hold that ability, let his ghouls do the work, and oftentimes that harass can really punish you and make lane quite hard to play. The other matchups, things like Scion tend to operate pretty well into Teemo. It's very, very hard to kill the champion, and as he scales into the game, he can oftentimes just disarm shrooms. Teemo obviously does have decent matchups, and like his safety of like going with things like Fleet, his W max, which can be an option, like you go like E into W max. Swifties can also be something you play around. Gives him some space to work with, but he's going to be within the B tier for the moment. Mundo going to be within my C tier. So Mundo's big weakness is sustained fighters. Gwen, Kled, Aatrox. Well, Kled doesn't technically fall under the sustained fighters category, but the anti-heal he provides on his Q can definitely be very punishing to play against. Aatrox, Gwen, obviously sustained fighters. They really enjoy playing into Mundo, as they can't really be killed by the champion, but then can heal most of the health bar and do lots of damage through either percentage health, max true damage and magic damage, or just being able to sustain by having really aggressive damage to healing ratios, which Aatrox does. In this case, Mundo going to be within the C tier. He's decent into matchups where he can really free scale, hit level 16, and just be really unkillable later on into the game. But yeah, avoid sustained fighters. They do punish you quite heavily. Yorick is primarily weak into fighters. Yorick's actually going to be within my S tier as well. Yorick's in a really good spot, especially for mid and low elo at the moment. Obviously, the higher up you go, the more spacing is going to be a lot more valuable, and being able to avoid his E. But ever since he increased the missile speed, there's definitely a lot more strength on that ability. It's a lot harder to miss. He's weak to things like Aurelia. Obviously, Aurelia being able to one-shot your ghouls can make it really hard to pilot that matchup. It can definitely be punishing. You can play it, though. I have seen Yorick's obviously win the matchup, especially if they are very proficient at the champion. Tryndamere also tends to be pretty rough, but obviously they've nerfed Tryndamere, so it's not as punishing as it used to be. Yorick in an incredible spot at the moment. I'd really recommend picking up this champion, especially if you are in the low and mid ranks, where he is definitely thriving as being one of the best, if not the best, top laner in the game. Renekton going to be within my B tier. Obviously, Renekton tends to be a pretty go-to pick within high elo and pro play. Within average play, I wouldn't really recommend this champion as a blind option, but tends to be just generalistically good answers to this pick. Tank matchups, kite matchups, fighter matchups. You can lose to just a lot of things like Alawi, Quinn. He primarily is just good into light fighters, where you can utilize your W, your burst potential, where it's just really hard for them to ever get a good trade into you. Think the likes of Yasuo, Yone, those matchups tend to be pretty good for Renekton, but he does have good tools to kind of sustain through matchups, but he primarily wants an advantage early, and if you're not able to find that, the champion definitely has a lot less value. He sits within the B tier for the moment. Alawi is going to be on my C tier. She's primarily weak to range and kite. Obviously, if you're not able to get a lot of value out of your E, combined with just the matchups being able to play outside of your Q range, can be really punishing. She obviously struggles into the likes of Maud and Yorick, where these matchups do just feel, like have really bad kind of like dynamics. Yorick, of course, if you can trap the Alawi, but ghouls can also block her E. In the Mordekaiser case, he can just take you to the Shadow Realm and you lose almost all your power through your tentacles. Very punishing to play against that matchup. It does mean she does have to ban some of them, and she really does lose a lot of blindable value. But if you're able to play Alawi into good matchups, she is incredibly strong, so it does make sense for her to be down here in the C tier. Yone is going to be with my D tier. Yone is obviously very much punished by burst and all-in matchups. Think Riven, think Renekton, where they can dodge some of your telegraphed abilities and then really retaliate, do a lot of burst. In Renekton's case, he is really, really aggressively skewed to be favoured in this matchup. Oftentimes, the Renekton can also proc the likes of bone plating. Yone does have options in like Fleet, Absorb Life, Second Wind, bone plating into certain matchups, but it does really he's still very much punished by a lot of these fighters, and Yone tends to be a bit on the weaker side at the moment, and like losing lethal tempo really does hurt a lot of his trading patterns. It does mean he is primarily just defaulting on Fleet and doesn't really have much other options outside of that, so a lot of his matchups are kind of like already predetermined by like this rune setup, which does give him a lot more sustain. Yeah, weak to burst, weak to all in. Ban Riven, ban Renekton. Tends to be primarily good into tanks where you can scale and you can just do a lot of damage through either having bulk or just being really strong within that matchup. Mordekaiser tends to be a pretty good matchup for Yone. I've seen that one get played out a decent amount. Moving on to Camille, she tends to be weak to primarily counter tools. Think Jaxi, think Teemo Blind. These tools can be really strong into Camille. Obviously, these other two picks I'd really recommend banning. Her primary thing she's good into are matchups where she can really just abuse them and not have a lot of retaliation, or she can just short trade, back off, and do a lot in the matchup through that. Obviously, Camille, well known for being very good into Garen in the higher ranks, can be really punishing to play that matchup. Does still have a lot of hard matchups though. She is a C tier option, but good in the matchups where you can really just punish the enemy without a lot of counterplay. Tryndamere is going to be B. He is weak to obviously stall tanks, sustain, kite, tools like that, which can really mitigate the amount of value his ultimate has, and his really aggressive trading patterns. Tryndamere tends to be pretty weak into the likes of Malphite and Tarm, and yeah, he belongs in the B tier for that. Once again, Fiora primarily used as a counterpick option, very good into telegraphed CC, primarily just weak into matchups where the W just doesn't have a huge amount of value, whether this is because they just don't have any forms of hard CC, or they can dodge it pretty comfortably, bait it out, stuff like that. Tryndamere tends to steamroll Fiora, and for that, she kind of, just in general, she kind of doesn't have as much value as a blind pick, but she is a great counterpick option, which she should be. She has one of the greatest counterpick tools in the game. I'm going to throw my phone over here because it keeps going off. But yeah, Fiora going to be within the C tier. Moving on to Kayle, she's also within the C tier. Kayle obviously not in as bad of a spot at the moment, as she has a lot of tools to kind of mitigate the damage counter matchups can have. Obviously, very weak to tools, which can cripple her ability to do things within the game. Things like Nasus W, Counter Strike obviously is another one which can work quite nice in this. Weak to all in, or matchups where they can all in, bait out ultimate, and then re-engage. Nasus Malphite tends to be pretty good into Kayle. They really mitigate her value within the game and can be quite punishing to play against if you ever do fall behind in lane, as they have really good mid games for the most part. Kayle going to be in the C tier, but she does have things she can opt into. Obviously, Fleet, Bone Plating, Absorb Life, yeah, stuff like that can all be quite nice on her. Moving on to Ornn, obviously tanks tend to have a bit more value as first pick options, as they can just inherently have value even when behind in the game, unlike carries for the most part. In Ornn's case, he's very weak to anti-tank. Champions which have true damage, percentage health damage, can be really punishing to play against this champion. But he's also very weak to scaling. He can be quite hard to play into matchups like your Kayle, stuff like that. I would recommend primarily banning Fiora Gwen, but keep in mind Kayle is a pretty bad matchup in this space as well. But as a tank, being able to itemize, give out items for your teammates definitely has a huge amount of value here. He is a very solid B tier option. I'm going to have to go quicker because this is 18 minutes in and we are only not even halfway through. Aurelia is in the C tier. So Aurelia is weak to all in, weak to burst. Think Poppy, Jax, Volibear, either having tools which are really good at mitigating her ability to all in on targets and have really good counter all in, or in a lot of cases just very good anti-mobility. That is where a lot of her weakness lies. Same goes for Riven, who is also going to be my C tier. She is very weak to anti-mobility, tends to be pretty weak to CC. She is one of the champions which struggles with CC the most in the game. Obviously her kit very much revolves around being mobile, being able to play into the enemy. Renekton and Garen tend to be pretty hard matchups in this, but obviously Poppy is another one which can be quite punishing to play against. Cassante getting him on my D tier. He's just inherently weak in solo queue for the most part, which does make a lot of his matchups more skewed against him. Yeah, so he's in the D tier. Weak to range, kite, anti-mobility. Poppy and Vayne are very hard matchups to play against this champion. We've seen them obviously in competitive quite a bit, but just generalistically solo queue, there's a lot more punishing matchups for this champion to play into. Tahm Kench, actually in a pretty good spot at the moment. He's primarily just weak against sustained fighters, where he can't really utilize his deceptively high damage, and they can kind of sustain through him. The likes of Aatrox, Gwen, very good at being sustained fighters into Tahm Kench. In Rumble's case, obviously, he tends to be pretty good in pro play, where he's playing primarily into tank matchups and can kind of be decent in those, but he's pretty weak to high mobility and burst matchups. Yone, Aurelia tend to be pretty favoured against him in solo queue, where they can really utilise their all-in and kill potential. Vayne, great counter pick option. Sits low C tier though for the most part, pretty weak to range and matchups where she isn't able to like sustain auto. Maybe this is through like Nasus W, Jaxi, so just crippling abilities which can like remove your ability to do a huge amount. Malphite E is another one. These can be all quite punishing matchups to play against. I'd recommend banning primarily Malphite and Jax if you are playing Vayne. Shen gonna be within my B tier. Shen also is pretty weak to sustain fighters. Mordekaiser, Gwen are pretty good into them, as they tend to be pretty ability based, which loses a lot of value on your W, as they can kind of like wait out the timer and then proceed to go in and continue trading into you. But for the most part, he's a solid B tier option. He tends to be pretty good into a lot of the other matchups and tends to be kind of a champion which can avoid lane. Argot tends to be pretty weak to sustain weak to range and health tanks, where you're not able to consistently get all-ins. Cleaver has less value into armor. I'm going to put Argot in the B tier for this reason. Weak to range, weak to health tank. Mundo and Mordekaiser tend to be pretty good as options into Argot. In Science case, he is going to be within my C tier. He's weak to anti-tank, he's weak to sustained fighters. Gwen, Aatrox, once again, very good options into a lot of these tankier matchups, where they can really make use of their full kits and the sustain they have. Gnar going to be within my B tier, so Gnar, solid ranged option, but tends to be pretty weak to all-in burst. Think Pantheon, think Aurelia, think Argot, stuff like that. Scaling tanks are also pretty good into Gnar, where he isn't able to get like kill threat early onto the game, and they can oftentimes outskill him throughout the game. Trundle going to be over my B tier. Trundle has a lot of sustain tools, but he tends to be pretty weak to range, kite, anti-auto attack based champions. Think Jax, think Teemo. These matchups can be very punishing to play against, where he can't really utilize his AA resets, that being like auto Q auto, his W attack speed steroid. E can have some dynamics with the matchups, but for the most part, he's decent against most things because of just the inherent sustain he has, but then yeah, weak against auto attack based anti-auto attack based champions. Gwen going to be within my D tier. Gwen very good as an anti-tank option. Blind pick, just not very good. She tends to be pretty weak to kite, range, all in. Akali, Singed are actually pretty good, really good matchups into Gwen. Akali's best matchup, I believe, has been Gwen for a while, but it is one of the few cases I'd really recommend playing Akali in the top lane. Outside of that, tends to be primarily just good as a mid lane option. But yeah, Gwen, weak to kite, range, all in, sits within the D tier. Gangplank actually has a lot of options now. He's getting better as he is continuously being buffed. Fleet seems to be his best keystone at the moment. You can run things like Absorb Life, you can run like Second Wind, Bone Plating. There are lots of solid options for you. He tends to be pretty weak to scaling, however. Maybe you're not able to punish the enemy so much throughout lane. He's also pretty weak to auto attack resetters. I think just tools like Cho'Gath E, for example. That one tends to be pretty hard to play against, where they can really easily pork your barrels before you are. Gwen, another one. And then, yeah, they can scale throughout the game and do a decent amount through that. Twisted Fate's going to be my D tier. This might surprise a lot of you, but Twisted Fate tends to be pretty weak within solo queue. He's primarily good against tankier options, which don't really have great all-in against him, where you can utilize his W. Obviously, very weak to matchups where he can't utilize Gold Card and loses that safety net. Jax, Yasuo, obviously, are like the competitively seen ones. Aurelia tends to be pretty strong into Twisted Fate as well. Weak to anti-auto attack, weak to all-in. Sits within the D tier. Jace has a decent amount of answers. Tends to be pretty weak to tanks. Tends to struggle killing them. Obviously, you can opt into like Conqueror and do a bit better in those matchups, but still can struggle in them. Weak to counter all in. That tends to be something he can struggle with as well. Where once if you try to answer with Q, they can oftentimes answer back and have a stronger all in combo, making it quite hard to really ever have kill threat. Malphite, Mundo tend to be pretty good matchups into Jace. Malphite very easy to pilot. Jace has to play very aggressively early to really not be pushed out of lane like level 5 to 9 onwards kind of thing. Pantheon is pretty weak to tanks. I've said this a million times at this point, but Pantheon really struggles against tanks. He really he just doesn't have the kill threat like ever. And once they have a bit of armor, it can really, like, you can oftentimes even just lose trades. Obviously, Conqueror does give you a bit more fighting power against them. Cleaver, even Bork in certain situations if they're health tanks. Malphite and Yorick tend to be pretty good matchups into Pantheon. These are very solid options and things I'd recommend banning. Gragas tends to be pretty weak to tanks and range. Gragas obviously has had his passive nerfed again going into this patch, which no longer makes his matchups as, you can no longer struggle for range matchups as easy as you once did. Obviously, you have tools which can help with this, whether this is like Phase Rush or into like Chase range, whether this is Arcing Comet into matchups where you can actively harass back against the range. You can also opt into things like Second Wind. D-Ring tends to be pretty, you tend to be pretty locked to D-Ring as you need that mana sustain, but Catalyst can be something you opt into. You can also have some tanky variations, which can definitely help, but yeah, weak to tank, weak to range. Mundo, Cho'Gath tend to be pretty good answers and will outscale you throughout the game. But he's still a very solid B tier option. Cho'Gath is going to be my D tier. There's just too many options into Cho'Gath. He's weak to anti-tank. He's weak to sustain fighters. Fiora, Gwen absolutely run this matchup. It's very hard for this pick to play into them. He belongs in the D tier. Kali also going to be on the D tier. She's only really played as like an answer to Gwen. I'd only really recommend her as an answer to Gwen. She's weak to anti-engage. She doesn't really have kill potential on tanks. Sion, Argot, very solid answers into her, but she's pretty weak into a lot of things. Skarner is just really bad at the moment. They massively over-nerfed him, which makes a lot of matchups skewed against him. He's weak to range. He's pretty weak to anti-tank matchups. He can even struggle into sustain matchups. Obviously, things like Riven, he did previously have the burst to kind of fight back against it and could punish her with like R, but with the damage going down, it's not anywhere near as favorable now. But gets to win it. Vayne tends to be one of the weakest ones for him at the moment. He really struggles into Vayne, but most things are just good into him currently on the patch. Quinn, not a bad spot, but tends to be pretty weak to tank auto attackers, as the same goes for like Vayne, Twisted Fate. But she's a bit better than Twisted Fate, as she's not as reliant on... she has some self-peel with E, which doesn't get countered so much by just anti-auto attack based abilities. Not as bad into the likes of Jax for that reason. Malphite, Aurelia do pretty well into her, and she can be punished by hard all-in, where she just doesn't really have the kill threat on them. Kennen, going to be over my beta, obviously very slippery champion, can be quite hard to pin down, but tends to be pretty weak into tanks where you can't really ever kill them or push them out of lane that easily. Also pretty weak to sustain. I think Mundo, once again, Yorick tends to be pretty good into some of these ranged options where he can punish them before they have windows of escape. Heimerdinger, also going to be on my beta. Heimerdinger, in this case, pretty weak to tank, sustain and range, but generalistically has decent matchups. Obviously, he's less common, so he has a bit of strength in that. Sion, Yorick tend to be pretty good matchups into him. Obviously, Yorick once again punishes ranged champions. Sion can stack off of his turret. Very hard to ever kill and move out of lane if he's ever... unless you're like really, really oppressive early on to the game, but oftentimes you can be punished by jungle for those reasons. Warwick tends to be pretty weak into range, but once again, a bit of a niche pick. Does have options in like some of the rune choices, some of the even summoner spell choices like barrier can be something you can opt into and find a decent successor. I've even seen some heal Warwicks, but weak to range. TF Kennen tend to be pretty good matchups against Warwick, where you really ever struggle to get on the champions. Maybe it's because of, in Twisted Fate's case, the W gold card. In Kennen's case, just his really high mobility can be quite hard to punish. Vladimir tends to be pretty weak to sustain tanks, where you can't really push them out of lane, and they can oftentimes sustain through your harass with Qs. Mundo and no, not Mundo. I mean, Mundo can work quite nicely in this one, but Nasus, Yorick tend to be pretty strong against the likes of Vladimir. Obviously, you can drop W on Vladimir, and he can't get out of your pool using his W. Nasus has the sustain to go through and kind of like maintain his place within the lane. Obviously, W can provide good chase, and the attack speed cripple obviously loses a lot of value here, but can still the slow itself can still just have enough value to make it pretty good in this matchup. Poppy is very weak to range and matchups where she doesn't really have a lot of W value. Teemo, Yorick, once again, pretty good matchups against Poppy, but she can go in the detail. There's a lot of range options which are really good to her, and oftentimes stat checky matchups where she can't really sustain fight back against them. Maybe she's not able to consistently get passive. Her W doesn't have high value. These can all be quite hard matchups for her. Pretty good into the likes of Aurelia. Like, I'd primarily just recommend her as a high mobility counter pick option. But yeah, Teemo, Yorick tend to be pretty hard matchups for her. Yasuo, primarily only used as a good anti-range option. The likes of Twisted Fate, Vayne can all be quite hard to pilot into Yasuo. But he's weak to all-in, weak to fighters, weak to tanks for the most part. Renekton is a must-ban. I see so many people insta-slam Renekton into the Yasuo matchup just because of how favourable it is for the Renekton side of things. Moving on, we have Kled. Kled is going to be with my C tier. He's pretty weak to range and anti-auto attackers. Once again, very reliant on his W for a lot of his damage. Fiora, really good, a really hard matchup for Kled to play. The W has a lot of value here. Poppy, really hard to play into as Kled, as the anti-mobility on the W can make it really hard to recast E and find like good chase angles. Olaf, weak to kite, weak to non-CC reliant champions. Think something like he's really good into matchups which are really dependent on their hard CC spells. Think Argot and Ornn, like matchups where Olaf is really favourable, just like the opposite of that. Trundle, Garen, likes of these aren't reliant on like their hard CC tools, or I mean either don't have hard CC tools or just kind of out-trade and outfight the Olaf, who obviously wants his ultimate to be valuable as it's an unstoppable against some of these CC-dependent matchups. Olaf, for this reason, going to be within the D tier. Singed. So Singed is going to be within my A tier. Singed is pretty weak to range and scaling, but actually has a decent amount of matchups, can oftentimes ignore lane, does have some tools to like work against some of these harass lanes, whether this is Fleet, Absorb Life, D-Shield, Second Wind, tools like these can all be quite nice. Argot TF tend to be pretty hard matchups for Singed to play against, as they are like solid ranged options, scale relatively well, have good mid games, can kind of operate without knowing that Singed is either going to proxy or just outright avoid lane oftentimes. Zac is weak to sustain fighters. Volley and Maud are pretty good bans, but for the most part he doesn't really have great answers outside of that. Obviously the higher up you go, the more you'll be punished for your laning phase, but as this is once again targeted towards like the 95% of players, Zac just isn't really going to see a lot of the matchups which will punish him, and primarily only Volley and Maud punish him in average play. And you can ban one of these and maybe ask a teammate to ban the other, and you should be good to go for the most part. Sylas, obviously very much known for just being a counter pick into Malphite. He's weak to fighters. Fiora and Argot tend to be pretty hard matchups for him. Argot can obviously mitigate Sylas's all-in potential. It's very telegraphed when Sylas is going to try and like play into you. Fiora can also parry Sylas, which is a very important ability for him, making it quite hard to play. Wukong tends to be pretty weak to anti-auto attackers. AP tanks can also be something he struggles into. Jax and Larry tend to be pretty favourable matchups against Wukong. He is within the D tier for this reason. Smolder going to be within my C tier. He is weak to anti-attackers and all-in. Aurelia, Yasuo, very good matchups for Smolder. Very good matchups against Smolder. Smolder obviously can utilise his flex potential almost as being like very deceptive. Like, you're not really going to see Smolder top, so if you pick it early, oftentimes people will think this is going in the bot lane, and it can give some value to your draft, but for the most part I'd recommend avoiding him as a first pick top lane option, as one, he's not the greatest, and two, there are decent answers to him. Udyr is going to be in the D tier. He is very weak to range and sustain matchups which can kite him quite easily. TF and Vayne are very hard to play against as Udyr. Oftentimes he'll run Ghost, can outrun you. Your Storm just loses a lot of value, and it can be quite punishing to play against. He's pretty good into tanks and matchups which are very reliant on fighting him, and he can outtrade them with his ultimate on his R. Cassiopeia is going to go within my B tier. Obviously obviously very weak to all in. That tends to be where a lot of her weaknesses lie. But if she can find a matchup where she can kite sufficiently, then it can be very hard to play against this champion. The matchups which seem to be, I mean, one of the matchups which is very punishing for Cassiopeia is Garen. Being able to run through your W full speed, being able to obviously block a level of the CC from your ultimate with his W. There's just a lot of dynamics in that matchup which favour Garen, making it very hard and punishing to play against. Varus is going to be within my D tier. He is very weak to all in and unstoppable. Obviously, Varus is pretty weak at the moment as well. They did over nerf him. I imagine they'll buff him up at some point, and it might make some of his matchups more favourable for him. But Olaf, Gwen, Yasuo, all very hard matchups for him to play against. Rammus, akin to Malphite, is very much reliant on very heavy AD compositions. If you draft Rammus early, you will see a lot of heavy AP answers to him. He's pretty weak to tanks as well. Oftentimes they can outscale him or provide more value within the game. Cho'Gath Mord tend to be pretty hard top laners to play against, but there are more atop of that, either which aren't auto-attack dependent, so his W loses a lot of value, or can kind of kite him out, and yeah, you're gonna incentivize AP from the enemy team. Ryze is going to be within my C tier, so Ryze has value being a mid and top flex option, but he tends to be pretty weak to all-in fighters and sustain tanks, relatively weak against Aurelia. Aurelia, very solid option against a lot of the top lane pool, but can really struggle against obviously some of the weak, some of the all-in and burst options. Poppy Jack's volley, as I said earlier. But yeah, Varus tends to struggle, not Varus, Ryze tends to struggle against all-in fighters and sustain tanks. And Naafiri is the last champion here. Naafiri obviously has value as being a mid and top flex option. Don't really see jungle Naafiri anymore, but she is also relatively weak to all-in fighters. Champions which can kind of play against her telegraph W. Maybe this is through some sort of shield, whether this is through damage mitigation, stuff like this. Aurelia, once again, a good example of a champion who is very good into Naafiri, oftentimes being able to very easily kill her dogs off and then trade quite nicely into her, being able to mitigate a lot of the damage through her W with her W. And those are my thoughts. So that is the average, this is like the average, I would call this the average player top lane first pick tier list, as it very much like focuses on what you can play as like solid options early on into draft without being as heavily counterpicked into the game. Obviously, the higher up you go, the matchup dynamics change massively. Favorable matchups can become hard matchups through like certain dynamics which more skilled players will implement. Some like creative rune choices, stuff like this, can oftentimes have a bit of a detriment there, but yeah, for the average player, this is kind of how I would recommend like first picking a champion. Those are my thoughts. So yeah, thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.